நான் வந்து வெளில கே ஆண்களை மீட் பண்ணியிருக்கிறேன். ஆனா அவரோட பேசும்போது சரியான ரேசிஸ்ட் துவேஷம் பிடிச்சவராக இருப்பினா, இல்லாட்டி பெண்களை ஒடுக்கி பேசுற ஒரு தன்மை இருந்திருக்கு. இல்லாட்டி அவையில் வந்து தங்களோட ப்ரிவிலேஜை இன்னும் உணரே இல்லை. They haven't realized their privilege. Because why would they question their privilege? They're white and male. Of course they're gay, but they're still white and male. So Desh Pradesh வந்து அந்த அங்கத்தவர் மட்டுமே, among us there was a விழிப்புணர்ச்சி. What is your privilege? You need to know your privilege. If you're going to work outside, you have to work inside first. So அந்த தேஷ் பிரதேசில் இருந்த ஒரு நங்கூரமாக இருந்த ஒரு ஐடியாலஜி என்னன்னா, நீங்கள் வெளிநோக்கி ஒரு செயல்பட போறீங்களோ, அரசியல் பட போறீங்களா, நீங்கள் உள்நோக்கியும் ஒரு அரசியலை கொண்டு வரணும். ஸோ உங்களுக்கு எல்லாம் வெரி இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங். உங்களுக்கு மூத்தோர் அண்ணா அக்கா மேரெல்லாம் இருந்தவே ஓப்பனாக கேட்பீங்க, உண்ட ப்ரிவிலேஜ் என்ன, உனக்கு தெரியுமா, நீ அரைக்கல வேறைக்கே எல்லாத்தையும் கொண்டு வர, உண்ட பேர் நீ இங்கிலீஷ்ல கரைக்கிற, அப்ப நீ பிரைவேட் ஸ்கூலுக்கு போற, நீ இலங்கையில இங்கிலீஷ் இப்படி இங்கிலீஷ்காக என்ன தெரிஞ்சது. இப்போ எல்லாரும் பிரைவேட் ஸ்கூலுக்கு போயிலே critical about the community of Daesh, because you had to go inside to move outside. நான் சொல்றது, does it make sense? Okay. And in that process, the people who empowered me at Daesh were the lesbians, specifically South Asian lesbians and black lesbians. என்னை அந்த பாதையில போட்டு என்னை வழிநடத்தி என்னை சூப்பர்வைஸ் பண்ணி ஊக்குவித்தது வந்து லெஸ்பியன்ஸ் தான் நான் சொல்லுவேன். Totally. தென்னாசிய lesbians and Africa இனத்தை சேர்ந்த lesbians who live in Toronto. அவையில் செய்த முறை வந்து very interesting. இப்படி பேச்சில் இந்த ஃபில்ம் பேர், ஆர்டரி லார்டை பற்றி படி, reading list. Poonam Koshila will give me a reading list. You need to read this. You need to read that. You need to see this film. So Angathavarmar idayile it was part of the process, empowering each other as well as trying to change the perspective outside. So this is basically a very brief outline of Kush and Daesh. There was a third aham play in Daesh, DMO. Ethane perukku DMO nyavanga irukku? Third aham say the play. Exactly. It was about dishwasher machine operator. It was about class. Tamil samudayathathil irukra class, varka verupaadu petti. Ellarukkum theriyum, Markham Theatre, 905, different reality. You know this. Yeah. 416, Parliament Wellesley, another reality. Yep. So this is a very important play. It's a play about class among Tamil community, and it was programmed at Daesh. இது ஏன் நாங்கள் செய்ய வேண்டி வந்ததுன்னா, சவுத் தென்னாசிய சமுதாயத்துல வந்து எங்களோட நாங்கள் செய்யற ஆர்ட், நாங்கள் ப்ரொடியூஸ் பண்ற லிட்ரேச்சர், நாங்கள் ப்ரொடியூஸ் பண்ற ஃபில்ம் wasn't seen as Indian enough or Sri Lankan Tamil enough. இந்த மெயின் ஸ்ட்ரீம் தென்னாசிய சமுதாயங்கள்ல வந்து தளங்கள்ல நாங்கள் செய்யற கலை வடிவங்கள் தமிழாக பார்க்கல. This is not Tamil. What is this? What play is this? There's no Bharatanatyam girl walking across, all beautifully done. What is this? It's not Tamil enough. We can't program you. No, sorry. And in the mainstream organization, didn't see it Indian enough. They didn't see it Tamil enough, because they had a very specific idea of what is Tamil, what is Indian in the white mainstream. They wanted Bharatanatyam, right? They wanted some ghazal, very, Eurocentric idea of what Asia is or South Asia is. And we were saying, no, this is the South Asia that we can talk about because it's our reality. We are bicultural, we are gay and lesbian. This is the reality we are talking about. அதுக்கு ஒரு தளம் இருக்கேல அந்த இடத்துல, அந்த நேரத்தில். அப்போ தேஷ் தான் அந்த தளமாக இருந்தது. இப்போ தேஷ் 13 வருஷம் இருந்து சாவாக்கு ஒரு புறப்படம் கொடுத்தது. சாவாக் வந்து சவுத் ஏஷியன் ஆர்ட்ஸ் விஷுவல் கலெக்டிவ், இப்போ சென்டர் உண்டு, அது ஈடுபட்டிருக்கு. ஆமாம், ஈடுபட்டாங்க. So now the personal analysis. I didn't fully feel I was part of Kush. But Kush is an organization irundhathu, South Asian Gay Men's Group and Women's Group. Adhula naan mulukka or angigaram கிடைக்காத ஒரு இடமா தான் இருந்தது. And Dunstan will agree as well, because I've talked to my good friend Dunstan about it. Because it's a South Asian gay organization But all of them, except for the two of us, are from North India. They spoke Hindi. They were very proud and will tell you, how aesthetically the light skin is better. And I come to the Tamil community and I know light skin is better. Right? That is the Tamil reality also. ஒரு பிள்ளை வந்து பிறந்தா என்ன சொல்லுவோம், வடிவான பிள்ளைன்னா வெள்ளையா தான் இருக்கணும். அப்ப அந்த நிறம்ன்ற அந்த 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 கூரான அந்த கத்தி குஷ்லையும் நடக்குது. And all the South Asian gay men in Kush, their object of desire was a white man. They wanted to meet and greet and be with a white man. But I didn't. My object of desire was a dark man. And the desire wasn't being fulfilled and empowered. White tane better, upward mobility. So in Kush, I didn't feel fully empowered because there was always that. The second issue was class. Most of them were educated. I was on campus, I was at university, but most of them were educated, professionals, extremely wealthy. அப்ப அந்த குஷல் இடத்துல ரெண்டாவது ஒரு இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங் என்னன்னா வர்க்க வேறுபாடு. எல்லாரும் படிச்சது, எல்லாரும் நல்ல வேலை, காசோட வந்த குடும்பங்கள். ஸோ அது இந்த ரியாலிட்டி இல்லை. நான் ஸ்ரீலங்காவில் ஃபேமிலியில் கிடக்கு காசு இருக்கல. அங்கே டக்ஸில் ரோட்ல இருந்து then we moved to Milton. இப்போ வர்க்க வேறுபாடு continue. Okay. So the first thing was color. The second thing was class. And I'll give you an example. One of the Kush meetings, all of us are sitting around, all of us are brown, gay, South Asian men. And the topic that day was, who was your first sexual encounter? நீங்கள் முதல் உங்களோட பாலியல் தொடர்பை யாரோட நீங்கள் முதல்ல ஆரம்பிச்சீங்க? Another topic, because it's about an topic, so talk about process. And 80% of the men, you know who their first sexual encounter was? With their servant. And Dustin and me are like looking at each other. We are like looking at each other, we're like, oh my God. Yes, right away, class right there. So Kush wasn't a place that fully, empowered my multifaceted being. But Desh did, because everything was critically analyzed, articulated, and then manifested. The second point why Desh was important to me, it created a space for gays and lesbians to create a legacy and history, because we were doing all that work in the mainstream organizations. In Tamil organizations, we were the MCs. We were bringing dance productions for the mainstream Tamil organizations. But they were not talking about us. In their history, we were absent. And we were silent, but we've always been there. Being the advisors, being the Mandari Padavi of Mandari Padavi, Anglamari, come be and Sandosham. But Anglapedi Karekela. So that's why Desh was created, a platform to express, validate, empower gay and lesbian history. So ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude here. இதோட நான் இந்த பேஜை நிறுத்திக்கொள்கிறேன். உங்களுக்கு கேள்வியில் இருந்தால் நாங்கள் மீண்டும் சந்திப்போம் Q&A time. So if you have any questions.
Hi, sorry. My name is Ramraj. I'm for short. I'm the MSM Prevention and Tamil Outreach Coordinator at the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention. So as Sudarshan mentioned, we talk about ASAP and the work I do there, but I'm going to give a little bit of a background as to who I am, because it helps me bring the perspective. Also, I apologize in advance. My Tamil is really bad, so this is going to be entirely English, but Sudarshan has volunteered to translate parts that may be confusing. And if I talk fast at some times, because it happens with nerves, just raise your hand and I'll kind of signal to slow down. Okay, so just a brief synopsis of what the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention is. I know Sudarshan did mention it. So this is literally a blurb from the website. We offer health promotion support for South Asians living with and affected by HIV and AIDS. We work with diverse communities on prevention and education. Our programs and services are delivered in culturally appropriate ways while simultaneously challenging the discomfort many have in talking about sex and sexuality. So I'm going to say sex and sexuality throughout this a lot just because I like to say those words. It may help if I give context. So about me, I was born and raised in Toronto, north end of the city. Sadly, it wasn't an area with a lot of brown people, so our family was one of the only ones in the area. I'm not loud enough, okay. So it was a very different space to be in than coming from a perspective. And I understand it has a lot to relate to, like, Sudarshan's story of being gay in the late 1980s. And so I'm just trying to draw that parallel there of growing up in an area which was predominantly white and having to deal with that, and then dealing with that again during my own coming out process, and how that affects the work I'm doing now. So my perception of what it meant to be Tamil existed between my family, religious spaces, film, and all that jazz. And so my identity was completely ridiculed growing up as being different. So if I brought curry to school, all that jazz. And so when I was growing up, I didn't know, I wasn't one of those lucky ones who knew I was gay right away. At like a really young age, it was kind of a process of challenging what society told me was correct. So as I got older, I realized that, you know, the way I viewed romance and all that other jazz was very different from what I was taught, what the fairy tale happy endings kind of spoke to. And so when I started coming out, it was during early university. And at that point, I had no gay peers, no examples. You just see exaggerated stereotypes on television. And anyone who I met that was gay was white. At that point I hadn't met a person of color. This is like 1920 I'm talking about right now. And I'd lived in the city in Toronto for all that time. So it's not like I'm coming from a space that's small town, it's Toronto, right? And so I was doing a lot of work with university LGBT services and nonprofits at that time. And even in those spaces, being Tamil and gay, I did not know existed. Clearly, I was an example of it, but I didn't see that in anyone else. And even being brown in other spaces didn't exist for me. It was predominantly white, and I didn't realize, I wasn't conscious of it at the time. You know, I thought this was just the reality. There weren't that many out there, but I was okay with it. And at that time, or at least I thought I was okay with it. So one day, I stumbled upon a YouTube video. I don't know if anyone has seen Brown Like Me. Show of hands, no. Maybe. Vijay was in it, so if you want to see Vijay a couple years ago, you should check it out. It's quite an interesting film. And when I found that video, it was really interesting. So it was put out by ASAP. I had no idea that in a couple of years later I'd be working for ASAP. So it was an interesting, it was just interesting. And so it talked about narratives of South Asians who were gay, both male and female, talking about their own coming up processes and growing up in Canadian society, which was predominantly white, and not having that association there, not having that community, not having that base to relate to. And so I found that very, very empowering, and it kind of sparked a series of events that I'm not going to get into because I'm not the person that would that's him. But that kind of led me to see that, you know, there was this gap that I wasn't addressing, and I kind of settled for whatever I was given, and being in that space, being the only brown guy there in a lot of spaces is what my reality was at the time, but it's entirely changed right now. So back to my role at ASAP. So I deal with two different communities, and I say different even though they kind of come together. So I deal with mainstream South Asian populations, and I deal with the Tamil community in specific. But I deal with what's known as MSM. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term MSM, but it's an epidemiological term, I said it without a flinch, for men who have sex with men. So now this doesn't exclusively talk about gay men, because when you think of men having sex with men, everyone says gay. Gay is like the only result of what that is, maybe bi. The reason why we use this term and we don't just say gay is because it is very inclusive of other terms. So whether you're gay, bi, queer, or even straight, just as long as the individual identifies as a man who has sex with other men. It might not be all the time, it might be sometimes, but this is the way that we were able to catch all those populations. Why this is important is going to tie into a part I'm getting into later on around shame, but for now, just take that as it is. So the outreach strategy at ASAP is very interesting. So we enter a lot of different spaces. So we don't just go, a lot of my work focuses, a majority of my work focuses on dealing with these MSM populations. And so we don't just go into queer or LGBT spaces to do outreach and work. We go into a lot of mainstream South Asian spaces, whether it be, and Tamil spaces rather, so Kondatam, Masalam and Dimesti, all these events that happen in the city throughout the year that are predominantly mainstream, and you don't necessarily see a highlighted queer presence at. And so, an example of what we'd be doing is, let's say it was Kondatam, and this is an example a colleague had told me of, and she was tabling at this event. She had a booth set up with our information on it, a banner, pamphlets, and we have these little condom packages that are these little squares. And so on the outside they're black, now they're purple, but you can't tell what's inside. And so, but inside there's a condom and a lube package. So it's promoting the whole safer sex bit. And so people love taking them sometimes, well, because it's free and they don't know what's inside. And so that's kind of why we have them in package, so we don't just have condoms sitting out there. And so you'll have a lot of people taking these things, and in many instances they'll take them, and especially kids will take them while their parents are standing there. So there isn't any issue with it. And some will open them right away, and we'll just drop it on the table right there, and like they had touched something that's like infectious in some way, and like they cut themselves on glass, or like they just drop it with so much fear. Some will gasp, some will just give us dirty looks, some will tell their children, no, don't touch that, we need to leave. And sometimes people yell. And so in this one instance, it wasn't me being there, people don't like yelling at me. Yeah, they do sometimes. But this girl, my colleague, was at this table, and this gentleman was actually getting into a heated debate with her. And luckily at that time, she had somebody like people were supporting her, community members around her came up and said something. But that isn't always the case. There isn't always that room for dialogue or support. It was a good example, it was a highlighted example, but she was actually getting yelled at in this debate for having condoms at an event, being inappropriate. So that's just to give you a snapshot of like the status of shame talking about sex. But yes, so going to outreaches, we do get a lot of looks, a lot of, especially when people read and we have like an image of, not an image, but information about STIs and what that means, talking about oral sex, anal sex, vaginal sex, whatever it may be. And when they read that, they just completely get this look of disturbance on their face. Like, why are we here? What are we doing? This is an inappropriate conversation to be having, almost as if we were encouraging sex in general. As if, you know, if we weren't giving out condoms, that sex wouldn't happen. So we're giving out condoms, we're encouraging sex to happen, is the message they're getting across. As opposed to, if we didn't have the condoms, their sex wouldn't be happening, you know, which is in itself interesting. And so the outreach strategy is to go, we go into those spaces, we go to have those confrontations, to challenge that stigma, to challenge that discrimination, to challenge that fear people have. Now, it's not always people getting scared of us. Sometimes, and this is a very common thing, people will see the information and, you know, maybe remember the website, which is asap.ca if anyone wants to know, and it's ASAAP, not ASSP, so ASAAP. And we'll call the office, and it'll be an anonymous phone call. They might get nervous and hang up right away, or they might call again. We might recognize their voice, we might not. It's a small office, so we're usually on that. And ask us about a service, whether it be Snathan, whether it be Dosti, whether it be support around questions about your sexuality, about your sexual health. And so a lot of the communication that we have when we go to outreaches in those spaces happens after, because people are very scared to come up to us and ask those questions. And the other interesting piece about outreaching is that if we decide to leave the table for 5 minutes and we come back, we get rid of, let's say, the 50 condoms on the table, all 50 are gone. As opposed to we're standing for an hour, maybe, you know, 10 will leave the table or 5. But as soon as we disappear and people think no one's looking, they will come and just take them. It's not like one person taking the entire bunch. We can stand up to the side and we'll see people will just keep coming and grabbing the free stuff, and they will put it back on the table. So it has a lot to do with if they're being seen and what that means. Because if they're seen doing this, it means something else if they're not seen. If they're doing this in hiding, if they're doing this and being invisible about it, which ties into another thing. So sex. I know I'm going to mention a lot, so here it is. Most people have it at some point in their lives, some regularly. Some like to think those are the lucky ones, and some purely for procreation. But for the most part, many of us are products of it. And I say that to be inclusive of people who are born in vitro, you know, it happens now, so it's cool.